During COVID, many people found themselves out of work. The government stepped in, raised the amount of unemployment benefits it dispersed, and also the number of people who could receive those benefits.
Let's remember that was during President Trump's first term.
And as with so many government benefits comes fraud. Experts say there's some $135 billion in COVID unemployment fraud that needs to be recovered. Now, the problem is the statute of limitations is up in March. Here with us to discuss is Stewart Whitson. He's an Army combat veteran, former FBI supervisory, special agent, and an attorney. He testified on the Hill this week to try to get the deadline extended and is with us now to explain more. Welcome to Rising.
Thanks for having me on.
So tell us, give us a sense of how big a problem this is and what this looming deadline means for recovering these funds.
Well, as you know, so obviously the DOGE effort has launched an unprecedented campaign to identify waste and fraud. And so one of the biggest areas where a tremendous amount of waste has occurred is during COVID with unemployment insurance being stolen by fraudsters. And so the full scope of the problem, you're looking at $135 billion of stolen funds just during those years. But get this, of the $135 billion, only $6.8 billion has been recovered. So that's basically 5%. So what does that mean? That means for every dollar stolen, only 5 cents has been recovered. And so, when you try to look at the picture and figure out why, I think for a lot of people, it's pretty clear the DOJ has been focused in other areas it shouldn't be. So obviously focus was on President Trump, focus was on, parents at school board meetings, focus was on Catholics practicing their faith. And so with a new leadership in place, with new folks at DOJ and FBI, there's a big opportunity to go after all this fraud. But there's one big problem, as you mentioned, the statute of limitations is actually going to run out in a few weeks. Good news is there's an easy fix.
And how does this fraud typically work? Is this the case of people filing for unemployment benefits when they have not actually lost their job as a result of COVID, or that they hadn't lost their job at all and they got the benefits anyway? How does this particular fraud work?
Well, a few different ways. One way will be, exactly as you said, they actually have a job on the side and they don't claim that, and so they go ahead and double dip and get the benefits. The other way it'll happen is across state lines. So, claiming benefits in one state while also claiming benefits in another state. A third way it'll happen is with transnational organized crime. And so stealing people's ID, those kind of things, and filing false claims to obtain money that way.
The question I have is that the whole issue of these PPE loans and so forth, and the fraud and the lost money, this was a conversation we were having years ago. Why is it that all of a sudden now, when the statute of limitations is about to be up or is passed, that it's coming up now? What is your feeling about why this wasn't looked into and handled, and also why it even happened the way it happened to begin with? Where was the dysfunction in our government that this was even allowed to occur, and why didn't they get on top of it sooner?
Well, I think, so obviously COVID presented an unprecedented, situation. So we never faced anything like that. And so 23 million Americans were suddenly pushed out of the workforce, and massive amounts of government funding had to then go to those people to help them get by. And that was understandable. But a couple problems happened. Whenever that much money is being pushed out and shared by the government, criminal organizations immediately go after it. And the reason they do is they know that if they steal from the government will just continue funding the program. The government will never run out of money, unlike other targets. And so the government makes a lucrative target in these type of environments. And they also know in this type of environment that the government, especially initially on, and rightfully so, is going to be very laser focused on getting benefits to people and not as much worried about stopping fraud. But unfortunately, the second part of the problem is that once COVID had the country kind of gained control of COVID, we started to return to normal. There was a hesitation by the Biden administration to lift the public emergency. And so for a long amount of time, funds were continuing to flow out to people. There was less oversight. And so that just kind of exacerbated the problem. And then the last kind of thing I kind of alluded to briefly is DOJ has just not been focused on this problem. And so they've got a team, I'm sure, of solid investigators working this, but like anything, resources are confined and they can only be pushed to wherever the current executive branch wants those resources pushed. And so as we saw in the news and, it's been well documented and well reported, most of that focus was going to things that can't be described in any other way than the politicization and weaponization of the DOJ to go after the Biden administration's political opponents. We saw that with President Trump, with unprecedented lawsuits and court filings that were waged against him. We saw it against school board, parents going to school board meetings, getting targeted by the FBI.
Yeah.
Then we saw it against Catholics doing nothing more than practicing their faith, they too being targeted. And so if resources are focused on that, they're not focused on where they should be, which is fraud. And so the reason this is important now is because in mere weeks from now, the statute of limitation will run out. And so what that means is even if these investigators have collected evidence, they've got a pretty solid case on a bad guy, and that investigation essentially ends because the ability to bring that charge in court ends with the statute of limitations.
Who was supposed to be watching out to make sure these payments were being given correctly in the first place? I asked that because, Marianne mentioned the PPE loans. There was also, billions of dollars given, for instance, to schools to upgrade their facilities, supposedly so they could reopen and get kids back in, make sure there was proper ventilation, things of that nature. And then districts got billions in funding and then didn't use it. They didn't use it to change anything, which is this massive scandal that we appropriate money and then they didn't even spend it. We're having trouble, I think, even understanding, what agencies in government are funding what. So we're going through USAID and, what various things it's funded. We recently discussed like a Wuhan Eco Health Alliance grant that they got. I was like, wait a minute, I thought NIAID was the group doing that. At least they provide oversight. Who was supposed to be providing oversight for these things? And do we have a problem where there's just too many different agencies doing similar work and they think, oh, you're the ones doing the monitoring when actually it's supposed to be us doing it?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of the problem, but you kind of alluded to a second part of the problem. So you've got this big, the fraud going on. There's responsibilities from state entities and federal entities, but they do have to kind of work together because a lot of this criminal activity happens over state lines. And so it's not easy to just leave it to the states to kind of track these folks down if it's criminal organizations operating across the country or across borders. So that's kind of a problem. But the other part of this that you alluded to, which is really important, is so much money was pushed out to the American people that maybe wasn't needed or maybe wasn't used. And so that's a lot of this money too. There's other avenues besides just going after the fraud and extending the statute of limitations. There also could be potential avenues to try to recoup some of those unused funds from businesses. And that's not to suggest that any of the businesses in this second case have violated the law or anything. They just took money that the government was offering them to use. And then if it turned out they did not need to use that money, then there's probably a good argument to be made that they should return that money. And so there may be some avenues for that as well.
Thank you so much for joining us to discuss this important issue. We really appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks for having me.